So now that in the last video we added this modal, which we'll use to add events by adding a form into that modal, we're now all set to finally create events with the help of our GraphQL backend API. So let's do just that, and by the end of this video, we'll have a couple of events added. So we prepared the modal. Let's now use it to add events. And therefore, this modal content paragraph, of course, will get replaced by a form that should actually hold the inputs for a new event. Now, I did have a look at the schema for my events in the last video. So just to have a quick look at it again, we will need to gather a title, a description, a price, and a date. So back here in my form, that means that I want to have some divs in there with a class name of form control to use this global styling we set up in index CSS, where I have form control styles that automatically add some styling to labels and so on in there. And therefore now in this form control, I'll add a label, and that label will say title, and it is for, with HTML4, my title input field with the ID title. The input here holds type text, or wants type text, has an ID of title, and will, well, gather text input in the end. Now, as we saw in our schema here, we need a description, a price, and a date as well. So let's add another form control for the price. So let's say price here. And the type therefore is number. And another form control for the date. And therefore, this is the event date. And the type here will be date. Last but not least, it's time for our last form control, which will hold the description of the event. So let's say description here. And this will actually not be an input. It'll be a text area with an ID of description. And let's say with 4 rows as a default. And yeah, with that, let's have a look at our modal. If I click create event, this is our form. Doesn't look too shabby. The nice thing is for the date, we get an automatic date picker in modern browsers, which is great. And yeah, price and title, that works. Price is a number input, as you can tell by the fact that we can increment and decrement this. Now, the description styling is not what I want. So in the index CSS file where I have my global styling, I want to make sure that I don't just style inputs in a form control, but that I also style my text areas in there so that the text area receives the same style as the input. So with that, that looks way better. I got my form added therefore, which was relatively easy. Now we need to make sure that we save the values the user enters and that we also use them when we click confirm here. On the events page here, in the modal confirm handler, I therefore want to gather all the values entered by the user. And we could use two-way binding for that. So we could use state and the onChange event here on the inputs to update the state for, let's say, the title here with every keystroke, and then bind this back through the value property. That would be possible, but I will use references because that's a really nice and easy way of handling this. To use references, I'll add a constructor here which receives props, where we have to call super props as a first step. And then, I think I also did this in the auth file, right? There, yeah, I already used references. So I'll use the exact same approach again. I'll have my title element reference, which is created with React create ref. And this will be replicated 3 times so that I also have a price L reference, that I also have my date L reference, and that I also have my description L reference. Now these refs need to be assigned down there in the template. So on this input here, I'll bind this first ref to my title L ref because this, well, holds my title. The second input here holds the price, so it'll be bound to this price L reference. The third input holds the date, so let's bind this to date L reference. And the last input. The text area here, of course, holds the description. So let's bind this to description L reference. And now we can use these refs to gather the value in modal confirm handler. So here I'll have my title, and I can get it from this title L reference current value. And again, this approach can be repeated for the price, for the date, and for the description. We can now create our new event object here, which is a JavaScript object where I just combine all these fields. And here I use a next-gen JavaScript shortcut where if the property name and the value name or the variable which holds the value have the same name, instead of writing title colon title and price colon price, you can omit the value and the colon. But this again only works if property name and the name of the variable that holds your value are the same, which is the case here. So let me then console log my event here to see if that worked. And let's also add some validation here to confirm that valid data was entered. And you could have more refined validation where you also highlight the inputs which are wrong. I'll simply add a check here where I see if title, if I trim it, has a length that is equal to 0, which means it's empty. Or if price, if I trim it, has a length which is equal to 0. Or if date, if I trim this, has a length that is equal to 0. Or last but not least, if description, if I trim it, has a length that is equal to 0. If either of these cases is the case, then I know something invalid was entered, and therefore here I'll then just return. Otherwise, I'll construct the event and log it here. So let's save that and open the developer tools in the console here to see output that we do log. And first of all, if I click confirm without any values, I see nothing, which kind of proves that the authentication works. And thereafter, I'll have a test here. Let's select today. And this is a test. And click confirm now. And this looks good. An event was constructed. And I got my date, I got my description, my price, and my test. So this is looking pretty good. Now for the date, I'd actually like to have a different format. I want to use date time dash local here, which allows me to set date and time simultaneously. So now with that, let's open this again. Test 1299. And then here I can choose a date and I can choose a time like 1250. This is another test. Let's hit confirm. And this now looks better. Now, date here should be a string because I want to submit a string to my backend. If you have a look at the schema again, the price should be a float. The date should be a string though. Currently though, the price also is a string if you have a look at it. That can be fixed relatively simple or in an easy way though. All we have to do is when we store the price here or when we extract it, I add a plus in front of this and this converts it to a number. So we have the event here. Obviously, we don't just fetch it to, well, then ignore it. Instead, I want to send this to the backend. And we send data to our GraphQL backend as we already practiced it in Auth.js here. There, I showed you how to construct a query and how to then send it. So I will copy all that code I have in there, starting from the request body all the way to the end of the then catch chain here, and copy that over into events.js. And yes, you could outsource this into a separate file and reuse it. I deliberately want to duplicate it here to make it really clear what belongs to what. So here in modal confirm handler, after creating that event, I now copy in that code which I copied from Auth.js, but obviously we'll have to adjust it. So my request body here will always be the same. So I don't need to check whether I'm logging in or anything like that. Instead, I can turn this into a const here. And I will have a mutation, that is correct. but I will target create event here. And I need to store or send my event input to that. If we have a look at the schema, event input then has title, description, price, and date. So these are the fields which now need to be set here. So I have my title, I have my description, I have my price, and I have my date. Now date will also be a string, price won't. So in here, we can now inject the price for the price, the description for the description, the title for the title, and at the end here for the date, I can also use date. So this now constructs the query for creating an event. Now, if we have a look at the schema, we see that for create event, we get back the event which was created. And if we have a look at the event type, we see we have an ID, title, description, and so on here. And I want to fetch all of that to see if that worked. So I get my ID, I get my title, my description, my date. What else do we have? Price and creator. So price and creator is again a complex object. There I want to get the ID and email. So this is now my mutation which I want to send. I sent this to GraphQL, obviously. That's the idea. We have one and the same endpoint. This configuration can stay as it is, though they're not really. One thing is missing, of course. I now need to attach my token. And that is why I do log in. I need that token, and I need that token to then send requests to protected endpoints. Now, what do we do with this token? At the moment, in app.js, where we handle the login, we store that token in our state here, and that state is then distributed through the auth context. This is pretty good and not a surprise because that is why we set it up this way. I can now access my auth context in events.js as well. Accessing is pretty easy. All we have to do is we have to add a static type here, which is named context type, a static property. Let me move it up there. And the type here, or the value of context type, will be my auth context. So I'll import my auth context here from context auth context and assign this auth context as a value here for context type. And with this, we got a this context property in the whole events.js file, or in this class to be precise, in the events page class. And this allows me to interact with the context. And this is pretty interesting because in the context, I'll be able to fetch my token. And that is what I need to append to the requests we're sending. Because if you have a look at the backend, in the schema, we don't see that. But we know, since we wrote this, that for events, when we create an event, we check whether we are authenticated. And if you recall, we do check this by parsing here with the isAuth middleware, by parsing our authorization header. And we want to retrieve a token from there, which should be added in the format authorization, that is the name of the header, and then the value, bearer, white space, and then the token. So that is exactly what I will attach on the front end now in events.js. When we send that request here, I need that token. So token can be fetched from this context token. This token field will be available on this context because this context is set equal to auth context. Now with the token available, I can add a new header, authorization, and set this equal to bearer, white space, and then my token, which I retrieve here. With that, I'm sending that query to that endpoint here in the end with my token added. And therefore, hopefully, I'm able to get a success response. And for now down there, I will simply console log res data. So let's save all of that and let's give it a try. Let's see if that works. If I create a new event, test, with $12.99 as a price, let's select today here and some time at afternoon. This is a test. And let's hit confirm. And I get price trim is not a function. which makes a lot of sense because I actually do convert price to a number here, so I can't trim it anymore. So here the check, of course, is not to trim the value. So let's change that logic and say it's invalid if price is smaller or equal than 0. So that price is greater than 0 are treated as valid. And with that change made to the validation logic, let's try this again. Let's enter a dummy title, a dummy price, choose a date here, and a description, and confirm. And I get back some errors here. Unauthenticated. So somehow that thing with the token didn't really work. Let's have a look at our network. If we have a look at our GraphQL request here, in the headers, which I sent, bearer was null, or the token was null, and that is also why it failed. So retrieving the token, that was the problem when I tried to retrieve it here from the context. And it makes sense because I'm not authenticated. It's kind of confusing because I haven't added logic to hide this create event part if we're not authenticated, because we shouldn't be able to see that, obviously. So let's log in here. And now that we have the logout button, which confirms that we are logged in, let's try this. Let's set the price. Let's set a date. This is a test. And let's now confirm this. And this looks now better. I get back data, and there I get my date as it was stored in the database. The date deviates from what I entered because of different time zones. That's all. It is the correct date, actually. Got my price, my description, and for the creator, I got the email and the ID. So our backend works, and we're able to create an event. And that event is now really stored in the database there. Now, with that, let's build up on this. And first of all, I want to make sure that I don't see this create event box if I'm not logged in, so that we avoid problems like before. So here I can simply add my check and say this context token, only if this exists, I want to render this div here. Otherwise, I won't. So now this whole events control box will only be visible if we are logged in. And if I save this, which logs me out, it's not visible. And if I log back in here with my credentials, then I do see it. So that's the first step. The second thing which I want to do is, of course, I want to be able to fetch the events and render them here so that we can also see the events we stored. And for now, I'll do this in a relatively easy way. I'll add a new section here on this page and give this a name of events list maybe. And in there, I want to render all my events which are in the database for now in a very simplified form. Actually, therefore, this will be an unordered list because that is what's in there. And I'll have my list items here, which I'll give a class name of events list item. And now let me add some styling here to events list, which is the unordered list box. So this part here. And then let's say we want to have a margin to the top of 2 rem. I want to have a width here of 40 rem, but a max width of 80% or 90%. Also add a margin to left and right of auto, and therefore I'll refactor this. Margin 2, rem to top and bottom then, and left and right is auto. And the list style should be none. I want to remove these bullet points, and I want to have no extra padding. Now on my events list items, which are the elements in this list, I'll also set a margin of, let's say, 1 rem top and bottom and 0 left and right. I'll give them a padding of 1 rem and add a border of 1 pixel solid and then this purple color. And yeah, that should be it for now. Now, of course, I need to dynamically populate this. So for now, let me just add 2 test items here so that we can see how this will theoretically look like this. It's okay for now. And now I want to populate this with data I fetch from my API, of course. And for this, let's have another look at our schema here in the index.js file in the schema folder. For queries, and we're now talking about a query, we got the events query, and that will give us a list or an array of events. So I want to send a query to events, and I don't need to pass any extra parameters there, just get this events list, and then, well, I'll get a list of these items here. So in events.js, I actually want to fetch these events right when we load this page, and then whenever we add a new event, I want to add that to that list. And there are multiple ways of achieving this. I will add a new method here to events.js, which I'll name fetch events, and in there I'll do just that. So I'll again copy that HTTP request logic we have up there and move it into fetch events. And I will probably refactor this at some point, but for now, let's just copy it. The request body here will now be a query, or will hold a query request, not a mutation. And the request is sent to just events. I have no argument list there, but I do get events with that structure. And let's fetch all that data for now. By the way, some of you already mentioned it in the comments, and I'm also aware of this problem. Creator here is, of course, a nested property, and as we currently set up our backend API, we quickly end up in a problem if we have many events, and for every event, we fetch the creator with an extra database round trip. And we'll later optimize this to reduce the amount of requests and, the amount of requests made to the database. So I'm aware of this, we'll do this at a later point of time. For now, we just don't have that many events that it's a problem, but we will take care about this later. So for now, I'll just fetch my events like this. The token does not need to be added here because this is not an endpoint that requires authentication. And here, I will get back my response. And first of all, I just want to have a look at it. So as I mentioned, this should execute whenever this component loads, and then whenever we added an event. Now, for the loading part, I of course can use a lifecycle hook. So I can add component did mount here, and component did mount executes when this page loads essentially. And in here, I will call this fetch events. So for now, that is all. If I now save this, if I reload that, we see this response. And there we have an events array with, right now we only have one event, that event in there, which I just created. So that works like a charm. Let's now add the logic to output that list of events here in our user interface. So for this, in my fetch events method here, when I get my events, I will drill into them and set them on my state as the events which I want to render. If you have a look in response data, we have a data field which has an events field, which is the array of events I'm interested in. So I'll extract that from rest data.data.events and store that in a new constant. And then I'll call this set state events is equal to the events I now fetched here. Now events is not a state I initialize, so let's do that too. Up there, I'll add events, which is an empty array initially, let's say. And therefore, we now set events on that events state as soon as we finished fetching. We can now use that events array down there to output our list of events. So in here, I want to output that list of events, and I'll prepare that before the return statements. So I'll have my event list here, and for this, I'll use this state events and map every element into a JSX element here. So every event here will be transformed into a list item with my class name of, what did I use? Well, basically into this list item here. So I can cut it from down there and use it up here. This is what every event will be transformed to. This is how you create lists and output lists in React. And of course, the value in there will not be hard-coded. Instead, that will be my, let's say, event title for now. And here we also need to set a key in React so that React can efficiently update that list when it re-renders it. So here I'll set this to event_ID, which is a perfect unique identifier. The event list is what I now want to output down there in my unordered list. So between the opening and closing tag of the unordered list, I will render my event list property, which holds that list of JSX elements. Due to map, we transform our list of events of JavaScript objects into JSX elements, and we can then output that list of JSX elements down there. That's how React works. So we have that list of JSX elements being output down there. Of course, I said I also want to fetch the events when I added a new one. Of course, that is a bit unnecessary though, but for now, let's do it like this. So here, once I'm done adding my event, I will call this fetch events again. So let's save that and let it reload. And I see test, which was the name of the event I created. Now let me log in here real quick. And let's create a new event. Another test is the title. 99.99, let's say. Let's pick a date. 1530. This is yet another test. And let's confirm this. And here it is. So it did save that and it did update here. Now we could add a spinner and everything, but for now we got this core functionality of adding events through our API and fetching them implemented. Now in the next videos, we'll make sure that we add stuff like a spinner, that we maybe save that extra round trip of fetching all events again when we created a new one. Why don't we just append that to the existing list? We could do that. So we'll work on things like that. And then, of course, we'll also implement the remaining endpoints which we have. Because if we have a look at our schema, we see that we're missing the book event and cancel bookings and this bookings endpoints. We're not handling this in the app right now. This will all follow in the next videos. Hopefully see you there. Bye.